Let's go to the Old Testament book of Genesis, and we're going to be in Genesis chapter 12. I hope you will turn there with me and pretty much stay right there for the biggest part of our lesson this afternoon. I was really excited and pleased with the introduction right up until he got to the spoiled, rotten brat part. I didn't see that coming. That kind of blindsided me. Wade and I and Alan and the rest of our family, the kids that go back a long way, and we get the opportunity occasionally to be at the same church together, and I always look forward to those times. It brings back a lot of good memories. We grew up in the same area, close by one another, and Wade's got a younger sister my age, and they called us the babies, I think. We were a little bit younger, not too much younger, but younger enough, I guess, where they thought we were the ones that they needed to try to leave behind and try to get away from so they could have some real fun. But we had a great childhood, and I appreciate Wade and the good work he's doing here. Good to see Alan, and good to see my parents, of course, able to be here this afternoon, and other folks that I've known for a while. My daughter was able to come up with me, so that's always exciting for me to get to bring some of my family with me. I've seen some of my old classmates from Memphis, and it's good to see you guys and appreciate the work that you're doing where God is using you. Our text this afternoon is Genesis chapter 12. This is one of those passages where, and anybody who's ever done a lesson, done a sermon, and has been assigned a passage before probably can sympathize with what I'm about to say, relate to it. You get a text like this one, and the gist of the story is this is a fairly familiar story, but it's not one we preach on a lot. It's a story about Abraham taking Sarah down to Egypt, and while he's there, he tells her to lie about who she is, and she's taken into the Pharaoh's harem, and eventually God sends some plagues, and Pharaoh says to Abram, "Why'd you do this?" And so he sends him out of the land. I mean, that's a story that you've heard probably many times before, but you don't necessarily, when I get it, I think, wow, what in the world am I going to do with that? I mean, how do you preach a sermon that's relevant in any way to people's lives? Not that every sermon necessarily has to, inform what you're going to do tomorrow when you go to work, but it needs to be interesting, it needs to be relevant in some way to what does this mean? Why did God put this there? Why did God tell us the story? Why couldn't He have skipped from Genesis 12, verse 9, all the way to chapter 13? Why does He tell us a story about a lie that Abraham told and God rescuing him and all that? I mean, how does that fit? So it's always fascinating. I love getting a text like this one because it forces you to go back and look at the text really closely and to try to figure out, try to the best of your ability to answer the question, why did God put this here? He had a reason. There are no verses in the Bible that God just accidentally put there. And so the text is there, the story is there for a reason, to help us figure out something that has relevance to our Christian life and to our appreciation for what Jesus Christ did for us. And I want to try to wrestle with the text with you this afternoon and see if we can get some of those lessons out as we go through it. Here's the approach I'm going to take. We're going to go through the text, first of all. Make sure that we understand a couple of historical details, cultural details, things that were happening, so that we understand what's happening. What does the story say? I think that's where you need to start with any text. What does it say? What did it mean? What did the people who first read it from Moses' pen, what did they get from it? What did they understand? So we'll look at that. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper than that and think about a couple of bigger implications, some sort of theological implications that we get from the text. And I think those will help us then as we go from there to this question about, okay, what does that mean to us practically speaking? That's going to be the approach we take, and I hope that it'll be helpful to you. Look at the text with me. I want to go ahead and read all 11 verses here, Genesis 12, starting in verse 10, going all the way through the end of the chapter. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarah his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you're my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife." Now therefore, here is your wife, take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Okay, that's the gist of the story. That's what happens. Now think with me about a couple of things a couple of questions we might ask as we go through it. I mean, the bare bones of it are pretty simple. There's a famine in the land. That's not the first famine in that part of the world, and certainly there are indications that periodically in history there have been periods of time where the famines have been worse. In fact, archaeologists tell us that about the time of this occurring, there was a 300-year period where the famines were particularly bad in the realm of Canaan. Because of the situation of Egypt with the Nile River, famines rarely affected them. You see that later on in the book of Genesis with Joseph and Israel and all that. But famines weren't so bad in Egypt because you had the Nile River that almost always kept the land saturated, and they were able to raise crops, and so there was usually food in Egypt. So he is following the custom of his people. He's following common wisdom of his day. One of the questions I think that would come up here is, was Abram doing this within the will of God or not? I think that's relevant to understanding the text. The Bible nowhere says that God asked him to go or God suggested that he go. In fact, God is noticeably absent from the text as far as Abram's trip down to Egypt. And because of some things that happened there and some consequences of that we'll talk about later on, I'd suggest to you that this is not according to the will of God. I think that when the famine came in the land of Canaan, it was a time of testing for Abram to see. He's just been given the promise, by the way, which is pretty important. First part of the chapter, verses 1 through 3, I think you've already studied that, this great promise that God called him out of Ur of the Chaldees and brought him to the land of Canaan. So he's made that promise. I'm going to take care of you, Canaan, Abraham. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you a great people. I'm going to bless the whole world through your descendants. I mean, those great promises. But then right after that, you'll see this often in Scripture, right after the call, right after the promises are given, God sends Abram into a time of testing. Do you really trust that I'm going to keep my word? Do you trust that when I make you a promise that I will orchestrate the events of your life in order to make sure that I fulfill that promise? Do you trust in me, Abram? So I think this is a time of testing, and I think here initially at least Abram fails that test. He looks around him, he knows what common wisdom suggests, and that is that when there's a famine in Canaan, you go south to Egypt and there you will find food. That's what happens regardless. He goes down to Egypt to escape the famine. So the first part of the text is just telling us what he tells Sarah. You know from Genesis 20 that Sarah was Abram's half-sister that had the same father, had a different mother, and so Abram perhaps is able to rationalize what he's doing here. You are my sister. I'm not telling a complete lie. I'm not asking you to tell a complete lie. You're just telling sort of a incomplete truth, that sort of thing, which we'll look at a bit later. Sometimes folks have questions here, just textually, about the fact that it says Sarah was a beautiful woman. She was an older lady at this point, and the way that words are often used, it seems a little bit out of place in the text for it to use the description, but that's only when you reckon beauty according to some 21st century standard of beauty. And looking at it from an ancient Hebrew perspective, way back in their day when they respected maturity and they respected age and they respected the way that a woman would hold herself, it is not incongruous with the text for the Bible to say that Sarah was very beautiful, even though she was an older lady at this point. So there's some things here that you might stumble over as you go through it, but I think really the text is pretty clear. When you look to the next section, verses 14 through 17, this is about the abduction. This is when Abram, what he predicted would happen, did happen. And Pharaoh's princes see her. They see that she is an attractive lady. They take her into Pharaoh's harem, and she's taken to be one of his wives. One of the things here, one of the questions you might have, if you've thought about this text much before, is this. Why did Abram disregard his wife in this way? What was he thinking? There's a lot of speculation about this. I mean, you think about what was he thinking? Why was he so apparently, at least self-centered about what happens here? The focus is very much on himself, isn't it? If you look in verse 13, you do this, lie for me, so that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. You pick up on a bit of self-centeredness there, don't you? I mean, Sarah, God made me the promise. He's going to bless the world through me. You kind of reading between the lines. He's going to bless the world through me. I got to protect that promise, Sarah, and you, quite honestly, may be a casualty of that. I don't think that's what Abram's thinking, but certainly it wouldn't be too far of a stretch to read it that way. I think more likely, knowing Abram for who we know him to be, that he's not thinking callously about his wife. In fact, I think it might be the case that at this point, Abram recognizes that as his brother, if the situation were to arise, as her brother, Abram would be in a position where he could negotiate to buy some time for them to get out of the land. I'd like to think about Abram in that way, that the whole situation is not that he thinks this is going to happen, but he's saying, if this does happen, if you tell them that I'm your brother, then they'll come to me and they'll negotiate a bride price, and during that negotiating period, I'll be able to snatch you and the rest of our crowd, and we'll get back to Canaan, to get you out of that situation. Honestly, we don't know. We don't know for sure what Abram was thinking. It might be the case that he is being self-centered here. The text just doesn't satisfy all of our curiosities here. But Pharaoh did what we thought he would do. He takes Sarah into his harem. And verse 16, he treated Abram well for her sake. This is a bride price, or rather it's a dowry. And if you look at this, you just read through it and you may think, well, he gave Abram a bunch of animals. But a couple of things here would point out the fact that this is actually a very significant dowry. You've got sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male and female servants. But the very last two, in the ancient world, in the world that they lived in, female donkeys and particularly camels, which had only recently been domesticated. Just about this time is when they became domesticated. Female donkeys were considered better for riding purposes, and camels had recently been domesticated. So those last two classes of animals indicate that this is an extremely generous gift. So when Pharaoh gives this gift to Abram, this made him a wealthy man. That's going to become important a little bit later. Look at the last part of the text, starting in verse 18 and going through the end of the chapter and really down to verse 1 of the next chapter. You've got the expulsion. A plague in verse 17, the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. We don't know what those plagues were. Some scholars have speculated that it was a sexual plague. Perhaps it was going through the harem. I think more likely, because that word is used in Leviticus and also in 2 Kings, the same Hebrew word is used to refer to some sort of a skin disorder, that it's more likely that there was a skin disease, a skin plague, that was going through Pharaoh's harem. And that's probably what it's talking about here. We'll talk more about the plagues in just a few minutes because I think it's a foreshadowing that's something that's going to happen later. Anyway, so Pharaoh calls him and he says, "What is this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife?" There's one more question I want you to think about at least. Verse 19. There's been a lot of speculation here about Sarah, if she might have been defiled, if Pharaoh might have actually taken her to be one of his wives in the physical sense, if he had had relations with her. Some people have speculated, yes, that it would have been the case that Pharaoh would have done that soon after she was taken into the harem. I think that's very unlikely to be the case here, simply because the language, when he says in verse 19, "I might have taken her as my wife," would indicate she was in the harem, but she had not yet been taken to be Pharaoh's wife. And you remember the story of Esther later on in the Old Testament, that some of the indications are there that there was a long period of preparation. When a woman was taken into a harem, there was a long period of preparation before she was actually brought before the Pharaoh, brought before the king. And also the language here is pretty specific. When the Bible wants to say that a woman has been defiled, it's not reticent to do that. It doesn't use some sort of language that we have to try to guess if that's what happened. It goes ahead and says it. In fact, other places in the book of Genesis, it goes ahead and says that. So I think when you read this, she had been taken into the harem. She had not yet been taken as Pharaoh's wife in the sexual sense. And so before they came together, God sent the plague so that, I think the reason God did it, He sent the plague so that wouldn't happen. So Sarah's purity for her husband would not be defiled. And the promise itself, back up in Genesis 12, would not have been defiled because God planned to preserve the seed through Abram and through Sarah. So in verse 20, it says, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. You ought to read that in a sense that this is not just, he's being courteous. There are a couple of things he wants to make sure happen. He wants to make sure that Abraham gets out. I think he's scared of Abraham's God. He didn't know much about Abraham's God, but he's scared. These plagues have scared him. And he doesn't want anything else to happen. He wants to make sure that Abraham gets out of the land, that he leaves. And number two, he wants to make sure that Abraham is not molested before he gets out. He doesn't want anything to happen to Abram because he's afraid that if something happens to Abram in the land of Egypt, then Abram's God would do something worse in Pharaoh's house. So I think that's the gist of it. And the text really ends at the first part of verse 1. in chapter 13, then Abram went up from Egypt. Look back up to verse 10 of chapter 12. There was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt. Verse 1 of chapter 13, then he went up from Egypt. Those two bookends are this paragraph telling us this little story about Abram. Okay, so that's the text itself. Let's spend a few minutes talking to you about a couple of implications here that are a little bit beneath the text out there, a little bit hidden within the text maybe. I want you to think with me for a second about some parallels here. God doesn't just tell stories for no purpose. He doesn't just put them there without a reason. In fact, the very way that God inspired Moses to retell these stories is telling. It points to certain things that we need to get out of the text. And a couple of those would be hidden, I think, or not hidden in some sort of a you can't find them sense, but you got to dig a little bit to get them. First of all, I want you to think in your mind about how many parallels there are between this story and what happened back in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3 is the garden episode, the Adam and Eve sinning episode where Eve took the fruit, gave it to Adam, he ate, God confronted them, they confessed it, and God expelled them from the Garden of Eden. So you got that story in Genesis 3, of course, would introduce sin into the human race and it was the fall of humanity, and began this period of time from then on to the end of time where God has been reconciling us to Himself. The whole story of the scheme of redemption started there in Genesis 3 with the fall, and then God saying, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to take care of this, I'm going to save people through the descendant of that woman. So that whole story in Genesis 3, I want you to notice a couple of parallels. If you want more details, I'd urge you to go and take a look at the manuscript because I included more there than I'm going to include in the lecture this afternoon. But there are some parallels. I want to give you 3 of them. Some of them you may not notice unless you look pretty closely. But just notice some of the consistent elements of these two stories, Genesis 3 and Genesis 12. Number 1, you've got food that is at the focal point of the story. In Genesis 3, of course, God said you can't eat of this particular tree, you can't take of that food. Here, the whole situation happens because there's a lack of food in Canaan. There's deception that's at the heart of the story. In Genesis 3, it's a deception of Satan toward Eve. In Genesis 12, it's deception of Abraham and Sarah toward Pharaoh and his household. You've got a wife that's at the center point, the centerpiece of the story. In Genesis 3, it's Eve. In Genesis 12, it's Sarah. You've got the discovery of the deception. Just notice how the story progresses. The discovery of the deception. God came to Adam and Eve and He said, what have you done? You've got the interrogation. God interrogates Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. You've got Pharaoh coming in interrogating Abram based on what had happened. You've got the admission of the guilt. You've got expulsion. Here they're expelled from the land of Egypt. In Genesis 3, they're expelled from the Garden of Eden. And then you've got family schism that follows. In chapter 4 of Genesis, right after the fall, you've got the schism that affected Adam and Eve's family with Cain and Abel. If you were to follow this story on in Genesis 13 and following chapters, you're going to see the schism that happened, I think, as a result of what happens in Egypt. You've got the wealth that was accumulated there. You've got the family problems that were a part of Abraham and Lot and the whole disagreement there in chapter 13. So, and then there are some lexical things, some of the way that the Hebrew wording is put. And again, Moses is telling this story. And it's interesting. I'll give you 3 of them. But Moses tells this story in a remarkably similar way, using similar words. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he uses the same wording to tell this story in Genesis 12 that he used when he told the story in Genesis 3. And those words, an original Hebrew reader would have picked up on. They would have seen those similarities. Let me give you 3 of them. One of them is in Genesis 12:18. Notice what it says. Pharaoh called Abram and he said, what is this you've done to me? What is this you've done to me? That's almost identical to Genesis 3:13 when God comes to Adam and He says, what is this that you've done? It's the wording is almost identical in the English and in the Hebrew as well. It's what is this you've done to me? The interrogation includes those words. A second one is also in verse 18 of Genesis 12 when it says, why did you not tell me? And then in Genesis 3:11 it says, who told you? And the verb told or tell is the same in both instances. And then you've got in Genesis 12:15, the princes of Pharaoh saw her. Notice this isn't the act of taking her. The princes of Pharaoh saw her, and then it says the woman was taken. That's Genesis 12:15. That may sound familiar to you from Genesis 3, because it says when the woman saw, again, the wording is the same. in the Hebrew. When the woman saw that the tree was good, she took of the fruit and ate. Remember that? So when they saw the woman, she was taken. When Eve saw the food, she took it. I mean, you just got these parallels. There are many, many more in that text. That when Moses is retelling this story by the inspiration of God, he's retelling it in a way that to a reader who's familiar with the text would have understood that he is meaning for this story to be told in such a way as to bring back memories of the fall. Now, why does that matter? And what would be the point of his doing that anyway? Well, one of the things is this. You know that the theme of the Bible, the whole story of the Bible is what is God doing to reconcile us to Himself? What is God doing to bring sinful humanity back to Himself? Well, in Genesis 3, as a result of the fall of Adam and Eve in that chapter, remember what God did? God expelled them from the Garden of Eden. They were kicked out of the garden. The swords, the cherubim, put up, and they cannot come back. So they're kicked out of the garden. But the rest of the Bible is about what? God getting us back to the garden. I mean, you go to the book of Revelation, and God is going to take us back to the garden at some point. I mean, the Garden of Paradise, God is going to bring us back. We're going to be reconciled to Him. And in the story in Genesis 12, what happens? They're expelled from Egypt, but there's a contrast here because Abram and Sarah are expelled from Egypt, but they're expelled with great wealth, and they go back to the land of Canaan. I think this is an interesting thing. That there, God is telling this story, and He orchestrates the events in Genesis 12 to help us to see that this is just a little foreshadowing of the big story. What is God doing in your life? What is He doing in the world today? He's bringing people back to Himself. And Abram and Sarah, even though Abram particularly was disobedient when they went down into the land of Egypt, lied about his wife, even though that happened, God rescued him and brought him out and gave him great wealth through that event. The outcome of Genesis 12 is different from the outcome of Genesis 3. There's a curse in Genesis 3, but there's a blessing in Genesis 12. And that's ultimately what we look forward to. Let me give you one more parallel here. This one will be a little clearer, I think. I think the former one is just as real, but this one is a little clearer. I believe Moses is foreshadowing the great event in the book of Exodus, the great Exodus. The latter part of the book of Genesis, the latter chapters, and then the early chapters of Exodus tell the story of Israel, of Jacob, and his family being in Canaan, and there's a famine. Remember the whole story? There's a famine. They send the sons down to Egypt, and as a result of God's providence and God working through Joseph and the whole, all that story, in 13, 14 chapters there in Genesis, God brings the nation of Israel down to Egypt. They're there. They're in bondage for 400 years, and then God sends them a deliverer, and He takes them through the use of plagues in Egypt, through Pharaoh's household, and the 10th plague, you remember, Moses then leads the people out of Egypt and back to the land of Canaan. Now, as I told that story, as you think about that story, you see some parallels to what happens here in Genesis 12? I think it's a fascinating thing. Stay with me through this, because think about all the things that are present in Genesis 12 that are also present in that story. One is you've got a severe famine. You've got a famine in the land of Canaan that leads to their going to Egypt. So you've got a famine that leads to Egypt. In the latter part of Genesis, you've got a famine that leads to a sojourn in Egypt. You've got killing of the males mentioned. Remember Pharaoh killing the newborn males in first part of the book of Exodus. Here in Genesis 12, though it's not in the same sense, you do have Abram fearing that he would be killed. You've got the bondage that Sarah was taken into bondage here. She was put into Pharaoh's harem. In the early chapters of Exodus, Israel is put into bondage in Egypt. You've got a plague that God sent here in Genesis 12. In fact, the wording is almost the same here in Genesis 12, and He's talking about the plagues as the wording of the plagues in the first part of the book of Exodus. You've got Pharaoh saying here in Genesis 12, he says, take your wife, here's your wife, take her and go your way. The language is remarkably similar to Pharaoh finally coming around in early chapters of Exodus and saying to Moses, take your animals and your flocks and your herds and go and get out of the land. The imperatives are almost the same in Genesis 12 and in Exodus. And then you've got great wealth. You remember in the book of Exodus when Israel left Egypt, remember they're leaving Egypt? They left with great wealth. God said to plunder the Egyptians, and so they left with great wealth. And you've got Abram and Sarah leaving Egypt here with great wealth. Okay, so why does that matter? Why does it matter? I think it gives us a clue of something very important here. Sometimes when we read the text, especially the Old Testament, we may go to it asking something that it was not intended to give. And I think one of those questions that we sometimes ask at the very first, I'm not saying this isn't a question we don't need to ask, only that it might not be always the first question we need to ask. One of the questions we always ask is, okay, what does that mean to me? What do I learn that I ought to do or ought not to do? And I think that's a legitimate question. It's a question that we ought to ask. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I think a lot of times it's a wrong question to ask at the beginning. And this is one of those texts, if we ask that question at the beginning, I think we walk away with an incomplete answer. The question I think we ought to ask when we study a passage like this, especially historical parts of the Old Testament, we ought to ask, what is there in this story that helps me to see the work of God in the world? What is God doing in the world? What does He do in this story to help me see the work of Jesus Christ, the atonement, the big story? How do I see Jesus here? And what do I learn from this? I think the way that Moses retold this story here is very important. He's looking back to Genesis 3 and he's using similar language. He's looking ahead to Exodus and he's foreshadowing this great event of redemption from the land of bondage. And you know how often that is used throughout the Old Testament and on into the New Testament, especially in the Psalms and the prophets, where they look back to the great Exodus, the great parting of the Red Sea, and they said, that is a type, that's an illustration of God's redemption, of God's salvation that's going to be finally fulfilled in the Messiah. They were looking ahead of that. And do you remember in Matthew 2, 14 and 15 when it says, he quotes a prophet Hosea, in Matthew 2 when Jesus was taken to Egypt as a baby and he comes back to Canaan, comes back to Judah. And it says, he quotes the Old Testament prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. Remember that? Calling Jesus back to the land of Canaan. Of course, that's a reference back to what God did in the life of Israel. He called them out of Egypt, my son Israel. They were God's disobedient son. They were imperfect. They couldn't keep the law. God's perfect son, the Son of God, came and He kept the law perfectly. And He was the perfect Son of God who did what His first son couldn't do. And so He's the new Moses, the new lawgiver. He's the new Adam, the one who brings life instead of death. And you've got all these ties there that help us to see what God is doing in the world. So out of Egypt have I called my son points back to the Exodus. But even here in the early days, in Genesis 12, what is God doing? He's showing how He is a God who redeems His people. They get outside of His will, and what does God do? God brings them back. We go down to Egypt, and God brings us back to Canaan. That whole little story is retold mostly in Exodus, but it's told in more subtle ways here in Genesis 12. It's told in Genesis 3 with the sin that Adam and Eve committed. And so that's our first practical lesson, okay? I've kind of merged into that. What do we learn from the text that's practical? Well, this is a very practical thing because it informs everything we do. And that lesson is Jesus goes down to Egypt and He brings His people back to Canaan. You see, that's what He did here. God went down to Egypt. He sent the plagues in Pharaoh's household. God went down to Egypt, and what did He do? He brought Abram and Sarah back to Canaan. And that's what God has always been doing. That's what He did when God's people were in Egypt in the early chapters of Exodus. That's what He did. In fact, the prophets make this connection. That's what He did, especially in Isaiah 40 through 55. Isaiah makes the connection to the Babylonian captivity that God's people would get themselves into through their disobedience. God sent them into captivity, but what did God do? To use Isaiah's words, God went down to Egypt, Babylon, and brought them back to Canaan. He brought their remnant back to Canaan. You see, God's always been doing that over and over and over again. And really, that's a story of what He's been doing since Genesis chapter 3. The whole story is about Jesus coming to Egypt and taking us to Canaan. That is a very important lesson that I think if we ask the question, well, what do I need to do or what do I not need to do? If that's the only question we ask, we're not going to get the complete answer. Because that doesn't really get to the meat of the story. It doesn't get to, I think, what God is doing here is He's showing that He goes down to Egypt and He brings His people back to Canaan. Now here's a second practical thing. God's promises depend on His call and not our conduct. Don't misinterpret that, because perhaps I should put an unless clause or an except clause in that. God does care about our conduct. He encourages us to follow Him, to obey Him, to live according to His principles for us. That's not what this suggests at all. Only that if you and I focus exclusively on what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, then we are not focusing on the main actor in every story. And by actor, I mean the one who is the one who permeates every scene and he makes everything happen. In this text, as well as any biblical text, is about what God is doing. It's about what God is doing. You see this, how beautifully it's displayed here in Genesis 12, though it doesn't mention it quite specifically here. In fact, God is noticeably absent from the text. It mentions him in verse 17, the Lord plagued Pharaoh, but for the most part, it doesn't say that God is bringing these things to happen, but we know that God, as a sovereign God, is behind everything that happens. Certainly not everything that happens is according to His will, but we see God's hand in this event. And what we get from this is that God has just made the call. He's just made the call of Abraham. Just made these promises. Is God going to fulfill those promises or not? See, the question here is, what if Abram's not obedient? Can God still fulfill His will? What if Abraham tells lies? What if he and Sarah take matters into their own hands and have a child through the handmaid, Hagar? What if they do that? And by the way, Hagar probably came from Egypt. She did come from it. She was Egyptian. She probably came from this very story. But what if Abram's not obedient? What if at times he strays? What if at times his faith isn't strong enough? Can God still keep His promise? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Absolutely. God is a promise-keeping God, and He doesn't depend on my help to make that happen. God works, and God keeps His promises. And when God made that promise in Genesis 12, it did not depend on Abraham's conduct. Now, God's going to bring Abraham along. He doesn't excuse what happens here, and He brings him along in his faith. It's a journey of faith, and ultimately Abraham becomes, I think in a respect, a man that he wasn't here, a father of the faithful, which he would be called. But God's promises, so what does that mean to us? Just perhaps something like this. You ever wonder if God's going to be able to do in your life what He promised He would do? Oh, He can do it. Oh, He can do it, and He will do it. God works sovereignly in your life and my life to bring about His will. Should we obey? Absolutely. Must we be obedient to His will? Of course. But we understand that God is the focal point of every story. And the focal point in your life and my life ought to be on Him. What is He doing? To Him be the glory. And God is responsible for the good that He works in me and you. God is the one. God is making the promise. God makes the call, and God keeps His promises, and He brings us out of Egypt. Number 3, here's a third practical lesson, and that is, and we get closer to that question we talked about earlier, actions have consequences. Actions and words have consequences. You have to wonder if Abraham would have gone down to Egypt had he known everything that was going to happen when he was there. Would he have gone? If he had known that all this stuff was going to happen. You think about the consequences of his actions. The Bible doesn't satisfy our curiosities about some of this. You know, what was Sarah thinking this whole time? When she told the lie and she was taken into Pharaoh's harem, you think about the fright, the absolute fear and uncertainty that must have been in Sarah's heart as she was taken into the harem of this king. And just the consequences of Abram's choice to go down into Egypt and to tell the lie. The immediate consequences. Then you've got Abram leaving with a lot of wealth. I mentioned that earlier. And then because of that wealth, it seems that leads directly into the conflict with Lot. And so because of Abraham's going down into Egypt, Sarah is afflicted. You've got family conflict as a result of the wealth that he brought about. He probably brought Hagar out of the land of Egypt as well. She was an Egyptian handmaid. And later on, that's going to lead to conflict within the family with Sarah, the birth of Ishmael, which is still having consequences in the world today because of the development of various people groups and religions in our world that still conflict today based on the fact that Abraham took Hagar and had Ishmael, and that wouldn't have happened probably if he hadn't gone down to Egypt. Do you see the consequences? You think about choices you and I might make. It's just a little lie. Just fudging on my taxes just a little bit. It's just a little innocent look at that woman who works at my office. Just a little compromise with what I'm looking at on the internet. Just a small compromise. Do you think potentially about the consequences that generations to come might feel when you and I compromise just a bit on what we know to be right? Abraham's choice here is still being felt today. And you wonder if you and I know all of us probably have experiences like this, if I could have seen how that was going to turn out, I wouldn't have done it. What God helps us to do in this story and the other stories is to help us to see we can't assume that our sin will just be an innocent, as if there were an innocent sin, but it'll have no really serious consequences. I urge you, young people, if you're listening, you make some choices. There are going to be consequences of those choices. Hear the story of Abram here. There are lessons to be learned when we ask, what do I need to learn from this? Don't tell half-truths. Don't tell the truth. Or better yet, don't even go down to Egypt where you're tempted to lie. Stay in Canaan. Stay there. Trust that God will take care of you. That you don't have to help God out. That was a problem Abraham had a hard time learning, wasn't it? I need to help God out. I need to have a son. I need to, let me help you, Lord. It was that kind of lesson he had a hard time learning, and we have a hard time learning. Lord, let us have faith in God. Let us have faith in our Lord that He will take care of us. If He calls us, if He makes us promises, He will empower us to live the kind of lives where He will fulfill those promises. Here's a last lesson, just quickly, and that is, sometimes God sends trials and tests into our lives to strengthen us, to bring about the kind of faith He wants us to have. I don't know how all this works. I don't know how all it works. I don't know how God sends us trials and testings. We know that He does. He certainly did in Abram's life in Genesis 22. God tested him. James chapter 1 tells us God doesn't tempt us. There's a fine line. I know God doesn't tempt us, but He does test us. There's a fine line there. God certainly doesn't tempt us to do evil, but He does put us in situations where we're tested. This is one of those times. And often this happens in Bible history. You have a call. You have a great event in someone's life. This great life-changing moment. And then you go from there into a moment of testing. That's what happens here. Happened with Elijah. 1 Kings 18 is at the top of Mount Carmel. And God sends down fire and consumes the altar. And they kill the prophets of Baal. And He comes down off of that mountain. What happens? Jezebel wants him dead. He runs for his life. Comes down off of Mount Carmel. And he ends up at the juniper tree. From the top of the mountain to the bottom of the valley. And to a time of testing. It happened with Jesus. After the baptism at the end of Matthew 3, where does He go? The Spirit immediately drove Him into the wilderness and He was tempted of the devil for 40 days. Same thing will happen to you and me. It'll happen in our congregations that we serve. If we're preachers, if we're elders, we're working with congregations. If you've been around for a little while, you know that when things are going well, it doesn't mean you need to, just be on edge, but you need to recognize Satan's going to be working, and God will allow it. God will allow testings to come. Why? Because through testings come faith. Through testings come endurance. The lessons that Abraham learned in Egypt in Genesis 12, he didn't fully get them, but God keeps working with him, doesn't He? Keeps working with him. You still have the Ishmael story. You still have this, but then you come to Genesis 22 where Abram goes up on that mountain and he's going to offer Ishmael. In his mind, he does offer Ishmael. So God works with him through testing, through trials, and through the various struggles of walking with God. He brings him along to the point where he is the man God called him to be. He's not that man in Genesis 12. He will be later on. That's what God's doing in you and me. It's what He does in our churches. It's what He does in our lives. He'll do great things, but He'll also take us to the valley of testing. He'll also take us to the place where we are put in a situation where our faith is tried. How are we going to respond to that? God will send deliverance through Jesus Christ, and He'll bring us out of Egypt, and He'll take us back to Canaan. Thank God that He's working in your life and my life, and that we serve a powerful and sovereign and loving God who will not be thwarted by Satan's designs to keep from accomplishing His almighty will. Thank you so much.
Well, that wasn't too bad for a spoiled brat. He did pretty good, didn't he? You know, sometimes I guess we could be accused of nepotism, but when your family delivers, like Chuck delivers, and Alan delivers, and Cliff delivers, I don't really get accused of that, you know. So I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful I asked them to come and deal with something, and they come and deal with it. And I appreciate the good lesson we just had. This is the time every day where we divide. We had a lesson on unity this morning, but we're going to stay united, but we're going to unite the sisters back in the fellowship hall. We're going to unite the brothers here in the auditorium. Dwayne Bryant is going to be here in the auditorium. He is going to be talking to us about Abraham and archaeology. He is uniquely educated and qualified to be able to talk about that subject. I think it'll be interesting to you to talk even a little bit of what Chuck talked about in this lesson and see how some of these things tie into the life of Abraham and support what the Bible has to say about Abraham. The ladies will be listening to Cindy Colley, and she will be speaking on Sarah, whose daughters you are, as long as. She's going to tell you what you have to do if you want to be one of Sarah's daughters. And so you are dismissed to go to your separate classes.